Mom, did you ever read Grandpa's final letter? My granddaughter Emily asked with an innocent smile that froze every heartbeat inside my chest. I looked up from the birthday cake I had just placed on the dining room table and forced a smile of my own. What letter, sweetheart? I asked quietly. The room fell silent. My son Michael stared into his glass. My daughter-in-law Olivia laughed a little too quickly and reached for the serving spoon as though nothing unusual had been said. Emily, honey, you must be thinking of someone else, she said before anyone else could speak. But I wasn't thinking about dessert anymore. I was thinking about my husband, Robert, who had passed away 4 years earlier. Robert had never hidden anything from me. After 43 years of marriage, we knew each other's routines better than we knew ourselves. If he had written a final letter, I would have remembered it. I would have treasured it. Yet I had never seen such a thing. I continued smiling through the rest of Emily's 17th birthday dinner, passing mashed potatoes, complimenting the roast chicken, asking about school and college plans, while a single question echoed louder than every conversation around the table. If there really was a letter, who received it instead of me? By the time everyone gathered in the backyard to watch Emily open her presents, I quietly stepped onto the back porch. The cool Connecticut evening carried the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming hydrangeas. Robert used to trim those bushes every Saturday morning before pouring us 2 cups of coffee on this very porch. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to picture his steady smile, his calm blue eyes, and the promise he whispered during the final week we spent together in the hospital. Everything is taken care of, Helen. You'll never have to worry. I had believed him. Even after discovering that our finances were far smaller than I expected, I never questioned his words. Michael had explained that medical expenses and business losses had consumed most of Robert's estate. Olivia had shown me neatly organized folders filled with numbers I barely understood. I trusted them because they were family. Because grief leaves very little room for suspicion. But standing alone that evening, I realized something else. Every important document after Robert's funeral had somehow passed through Olivia's hands first. Every conversation about money had ended before I could ask another question. Every decision had already been made by the time I heard about it. I had mistaken efficiency for kindness. Maybe it had been something else all along. Behind me I heard laughter as Emily hugged her friends, completely unaware that one simple question had cracked open a mystery my own family never intended me to discover. I looked through the kitchen window and saw Olivia watching me for just a second before she quickly looked away. It wasn't fear I saw on her face. It was recognition. She knew exactly what Emily's question meant. And for the first time since Robert's funeral, I realized my family hadn't only been hiding their wealth from me. They had been hiding the truth. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Emily's innocent voice asking about a letter that I had never received. By sunrise, I was already sitting in my kitchen with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The morning light filtered through the same lace curtains Robert and I had picked out together nearly 20 years earlier. They had faded with time, just as many of my memories had softened around the edges. Yet one memory remained perfectly clear. Robert had always insisted that every important paper belonged where both of us could find it. He used to joke that secrets had no place inside a marriage. That was why the thought of a hidden letter felt impossible. I quietly opened the hallway closet and pulled out the old cedar box where I kept family photographs, greeting cards, and every anniversary letter Robert had ever written to me. I unfolded each one carefully, recognizing his familiar handwriting before I even read a single word. Some letters spoke about vacations we hoped to take after retirement. Others thanked me for raising Michael with patience and kindness. One simply said that growing old beside me had been the greatest blessing of his life. I smiled through tears, but there was no final letter. Nothing written during his last days. Nothing that explained the promise he had whispered in the hospital. My attention shifted toward another memory that had never seemed important until now. 3 days after Robert's funeral, Olivia had arrived carrying several neatly labeled folders. She told me that she had organized all of Robert's financial records because Michael was overwhelmed with grief. I remembered feeling grateful at the time. She spoke confidently, answered every question before I could finish asking it, and assured me that there was very little left after taxes, medical bills, and business obligations. Michael had simply nodded beside her. He looked exhausted, so I never questioned either of them. Looking back now, I realized something else. I had never actually read any of those documents myself. I had trusted the summaries they gave me instead of asking for every page. During the months that followed, strange little moments had quietly slipped past me without raising concern. Birthday cards from distant relatives occasionally arrived already opened. Bank statements suddenly became electronic because Olivia insisted it was more convenient. When I offered to help organize Robert's office, she gently suggested that Michael had already taken care of everything. At the time, every explanation sounded thoughtful. Together they formed a picture of a caring family protecting a grieving widow. Separately, they now felt like carefully placed doors that kept me from seeing something important. I walked into Robert's old study for the first time in months. His favorite reading chair still faced the window. A faded baseball cap rested on the bookshelf exactly where he had left it. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old books. I slowly opened the bottom drawer of his desk, expecting nothing more than old receipts and stationery. Instead, I found an empty folder with a handwritten label on the front. Family Trust. My hands froze. The folder had no papers inside. Only a thin outline in the dust suggested that something much thicker had once been stored there. I gently closed the drawer, but one thought refused to leave my mind. Someone had not only removed the documents. Someone had known exactly where to find them. The empty folder stayed in my thoughts for the rest of the afternoon. I did not call Michael. I did not confront Olivia. If there was one lesson life had taught me after 68 years, it was that people revealed far more when they believed no one was paying attention. Instead, I made myself another cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and wrote down everything I could remember from the weeks following Robert's passing. At first, the list seemed ordinary. Olivia had offered to organize the paperwork. Michael had handled the meetings with accountants. They both insisted I should focus on healing instead of financial matters. But as I continued writing, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every important decision had been made without me. Every signature they requested came with reassuring smiles and simple explanations. Every time I asked for copies, someone promised to bring them later. Somehow later never arrived. The following morning, I drove to the local bank where Robert and I had kept our accounts for more than 30 years. The familiar brick building looked exactly the same. Even the flower boxes beneath the windows reminded me of the spring mornings when Robert would stop there before taking me to breakfast. A young teller greeted me warmly, but she could not access records from several years earlier. She politely asked me to wait while she spoke with the branch manager. A few minutes later, an older gentleman stepped into the lobby and paused the moment he saw me. His expression shifted from polite professionalism to genuine surprise. "Mrs. Carter," he said, extending his hand. "It has been a long time. I am Thomas Green. I worked closely with your husband." His name sounded familiar, although I could not immediately place it. We sat together in a quiet office overlooking the parking lot. He asked how I had been doing since Robert's passing, and I answered honestly that some days were easier than others. Then I mentioned the empty folder labeled Family Trust. Thomas became unusually quiet. He folded his hands together and looked at me carefully before asking a question that caught me completely off guard. "Did your attorney never review the trust with you?" I felt my stomach tighten. "I do not remember anyone reviewing a trust," I replied. "My son told me there was very little left after the estate was settled." Thomas frowned, not dramatically, but enough for me to notice. "That is unexpected," he said slowly. "I distinctly remember your husband arranging several meetings because he wanted to make certain you understood everything." My heartbeat quickened. "Are you certain it was me?" I asked. He nodded without hesitation. "Absolutely. Robert spoke about those meetings many times. He wanted you protected above all else." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Thomas eventually apologized and explained that bank privacy rules prevented him from discussing confidential documents without proper authorization. Still, before I left, He quietly handed me the business card of an attorney whose name I had not heard in years. Daniel Brooks. If anyone can answer your questions, Thomas said gently, it will be him. I slipped the card into my purse, thanked him, and walked back to my car. Sitting behind the steering wheel, I stared at the name printed in dark blue ink. Daniel Brooks had been Robert's closest legal advisor for nearly 2 decades. If he had truly prepared meetings for me that never happened, then someone had done much more than hide a letter. Someone had rewritten the final chapter of my husband's life without ever allowing me to read it. I did not call Daniel Brooks that afternoon. Instead, I drove home with his business card resting on the passenger seat beside me, as though it carried a weight far greater than a piece of paper ever should. Every few miles I glanced at his name again, wondering why Robert had trusted him so completely and why I had allowed 4 years to pass without asking a single question. The answer was painfully simple. I had believed my family. That evening Michael called to check on me, something he usually did once or twice a week. His voice sounded warm and familiar, asking whether I had enjoyed Emily's birthday and whether I needed anything from the grocery store. I answered exactly as I always had. I thanked him for calling, told him the party had been lovely, and asked how work was going. He spoke about new clients, long meetings, and an upcoming business trip. Not once did he mention the letter Emily had asked about. Not once did he ask why I had looked so surprised. Before ending the call, he reminded me that Olivia wanted to stop by later that week to help organize a few things around my house. For the first time, I politely declined. I told him I was planning to spend several days sorting through Robert's belongings myself. There was a brief pause before he replied, almost too casually, that there probably was not much left to organize. His words lingered in my mind long after we hung up. The next morning, I called Daniel's office. His assistant answered with a calm, professional voice and placed me on hold for only a moment. When she returned, her tone had changed completely. She asked whether I was Helen Carter, then apologized before explaining that Mr. Brooks would rearrange his afternoon schedule to meet with me personally. That surprised me. Attorneys rarely cancel appointments without good reason. I arrived at his office shortly before 2 o'clock. The building overlooked a quiet green in the center of town, and the polished brass directory in the lobby still listed Brooks' legal group exactly as I remembered. Daniel himself greeted me in the reception area. He looked older than I remembered, with silver hair and reading glasses hanging from a cord around his neck, but his handshake remained steady. There was genuine kindness in his eyes, followed almost immediately by something else. Concern. He escorted me into his office, closed the door softly, and waited until I had taken a seat. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. He simply studied my face as though trying to answer a question he had carried for years. Finally, he leaned forward and asked quietly, "Helen, before we begin, I need you to answer one question honestly. Did you ever attend the estate planning meeting Robert specifically arranged for you 6 weeks before he passed away?" I shook my head without hesitation. "No," I replied. "I never knew there was such a meeting." Daniel slowly removed his glasses and lowered his eyes to the desk. He let out a long breath that sounded less like surprise and more like confirmation. When he looked back at me, his expression carried the sadness of a man who had just realized his worst suspicion had been true all along. Then he opened a locked drawer beside his desk and carefully placed a thick sealed envelope between us. Written across the front in Robert's unmistakable handwriting were 5 words that made my hands begin to tremble. For my wife Helen only. My fingers rested on the sealed envelope for several long seconds before I finally looked up at Daniel. "Why did no one ever tell me this existed?" I asked. His expression carried the quiet exhaustion of someone who had waited years for a conversation that should have happened long ago. "Because I believed you already had it," he answered. "Your husband instructed me to give it to you personally during our scheduled meeting. The appointment was canceled the morning before it was supposed to happen. I received a call explaining that you were emotionally overwhelmed and wanted Michael to handle everything instead. Since the request appeared to come from the family, I believed it reflected your wishes." My heart sank. I had never canceled any meeting. In fact, I had never known one had been scheduled. Carefully, I broke the seal and unfolded the first page. Robert's familiar handwriting immediately brought tears to my eyes. He wrote that if I was reading the letter, it meant he was no longer beside me, but that every important decision had been made to ensure I would always be secure. He reminded me that we had spent decades building not only financial stability, but also a legacy meant to protect future generations. Then I reached a sentence that forced me to stop reading for a moment. Helen, everything we built has been placed inside the Carter Family Trust, and you alone will have the authority to decide how it is managed. I slowly looked back at Daniel. Michael told me there was almost nothing left, I whispered. Daniel nodded gently before opening a thick binder that had remained on his desk. Inside were copies of legal documents, signatures, meeting notes, and correspondence stretching back several years. Every page confirmed the same reality. Robert had never intended for me to lose control of our family's assets. Quite the opposite. He had carefully structured everything so that I could oversee it with professional guidance for the rest of my life. Daniel quietly explained that the trust owned several investments, commercial properties, and substantial savings that continued to generate income. None of those assets had disappeared. They had simply never been discussed with me after Robert's passing. My thoughts raced through every conversation I had shared with Michael and Olivia during those difficult months. Every reassuring explanation suddenly sounded different. Every convenient decision now seemed far less innocent than I had believed. Yet even then, I refused to assume the worst. I needed facts, not anger. I needed evidence, not accusations. Daniel seemed to understand exactly what I was thinking. He closed the binder and slid a smaller folder toward me. Helen, he said quietly, before anyone is confronted, you deserve to understand the complete timeline. These documents explain who attended each meeting, who signed every acknowledgement, and who requested that future communications no longer be sent directly to your home. Once you have read them, you will know exactly where the truth begins and where it was changed. I took the folder with steady hands. Whatever answers I had been searching for were finally within reach, and for the first time in 4 years, I no longer felt like someone living inside someone else's version of my own life. I carried the folder home without opening it in the car. The temptation was there, but so was Robert's voice in the back of my mind, always reminding me never to make important decisions while emotions were running high. I waited until evening, brewed a fresh pot of tea, and sat in the same living room where we had spent countless quiet nights together. Outside, the sun slipped behind the maple trees, filling the room with a warm amber light that made everything feel strangely peaceful. Inside the folder were copies of correspondence arranged by date. The first few pages showed routine legal communications between Daniel's office and Robert while he was still alive. Then the timeline reached the weeks after his passing. That was when everything changed. A signed request instructed Daniel's office to direct future scheduling notices and administrative correspondence through Michael because I supposedly wished to avoid additional emotional stress. Another document requested that certain financial summaries be delivered electronically rather than by mail. Daniel had highlighted each page with small notes explaining when the requests had been received and who had attended each meeting. My own name appeared throughout the paperwork, yet there was not a single signature in my handwriting. Every authorization had been completed by someone acting on my behalf. Daniel had also included copies of appointment confirmations that had been mailed to an address I no longer recognized. The letters had never reached my home. They had been redirected almost immediately after Robert's funeral. I closed my eyes and tried to remember whether I had ever agreed to such a change. I had not. The realization settled over me quietly. This had not been one misunderstanding or one forgotten conversation. It had been a long chain of decisions that slowly placed me farther away from information that rightfully belonged to me. Even then, I refused to believe that Michael had intended to hurt me. I remembered the exhausted young man who had stood beside me at Robert's funeral, struggling to comfort everyone while grieving his own father. It was entirely possible that he had trusted someone else's judgment just as completely as I had. Olivia, on the other hand, had managed nearly every conversation involving paperwork. She had always seemed prepared with answers before questions were even finished. Looking back, I realized she rarely encouraged me to participate. Instead, she gently reassured me that everything had already been handled. The following morning, Daniel called to see whether I had finished reviewing the documents. I thanked him for preserving every record so carefully. He remained silent for a moment before saying something that caught my attention immediately. Helen, there is one more piece of evidence that I have not shown you yet because I wanted you to understand the timeline first. He explained that Robert had insisted on recording a private video message during his final estate planning meeting. The recording had been stored with the trust documents and was intended to be viewed only by me if questions about his wishes ever arose. Daniel asked whether I would be willing to return to his office the next afternoon. I accepted without hesitation. After ending the call, I walked into Robert's study once again. This time I did not feel confused. I felt focused. Somewhere inside that video, I believed my husband had left more than memories. I believed he had left the truth exactly as he wanted me to hear it, in his own voice, untouched by anyone else's explanation. The next afternoon, Daniel dimmed the lights in his office and placed a small laptop on the conference table between us. He did not say a word as the video began to play. Robert appeared on the screen wearing the same navy sweater he always reached for on cool autumn mornings. He smiled gently, exactly the way I remembered, and for a brief moment it felt as though the past 4 years had disappeared. "Hello, my love," he began. "If you are watching this, then something did not happen the way I planned." Tears filled my eyes before he had spoken another sentence. Robert explained that he wanted me to hear his intentions directly from him so there would never be confusion about the future of our family. He spoke about the Carter Family Trust, describing it as the foundation we had built together over decades of careful work and shared sacrifice. He reminded me that every rental property, every investment account, and every business interest had been transferred into the trust before his illness became serious. Then he looked directly into the camera and said the words that changed everything. "Helen, you are the sole trustee. No major decision can be made without your approval. Michael is a beneficiary because he is our son, but leadership belongs to you for as long as you choose." I felt my breath catch. Robert continued by explaining that he hoped Michael would one day assume greater responsibility, but only after demonstrating patience, integrity, and respect for family. He wanted future generations, including Emily, to benefit from the trust for education and opportunity rather than unnecessary luxury. "Money should strengthen a family," he said softly. "It should never become the reason people stop telling each other the truth." The screen faded to black, leaving the room completely silent. Daniel waited respectfully before speaking. He slid another folder across the table containing updated financial statements. The trust remained healthy. The investments had continued to grow steadily over the years under professional management. Nothing had disappeared. Nothing had been lost. The real loss had been my place in decisions that Robert had clearly entrusted to me. Daniel calmly explained the legal options available. Every document necessary to restore direct communication with the trustees could be activated immediately. Future statements would come to my home. Every meeting would include me personally. No accusations needed to be made before the facts were fully reviewed. That approach felt right. Robert had always believed that truth was strongest when it stood on its own. As I gathered the folders and carefully placed Robert's letter back into its envelope, I no longer felt like someone searching for answers. I felt like the guardian of a promise my husband had made years earlier. Outside Daniel's office, the afternoon sun reflected across the town square as families walked past the old courthouse. Life continued as though nothing had changed. Yet everything had changed. Michael and Olivia still believed I knew only the story they had allowed me to hear. They had no idea that I had now heard Robert's voice, read his own words, and seen every document with my own eyes. I quietly placed the envelope on the passenger seat beside me, started the engine, and drove home knowing that the next family dinner would not begin with questions. It would begin with the truth.